Welcome back to Rod's Radios. This is part 2 of the Telefunken Opus 8. As you can see, I've taken the chassis out of the cabinet and mounted it into my wooden frame, which means I can maneuver the chassis around safely without doing any major damage, hopefully. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of crustification on the front here. Rust has ingrained itself into the back panel. And there's other parts of the radio that is also showing signs of rust, but not too bad, and hopefully we'll be able to fix that. The dial bulbs have gone black, but they are actually still working. And I think the first thing I'm going to do, oh, by the way, I have fixed the AM dial drive, which wasn't broken, but just stuck at one end because the tuning capacitor had got quite solid and it wasn't turning properly, and it was putting strain on the shaft as I tuned it. Nothing was actually happening. So I've oiled all these points along here and it's moving quite smoothly now, as you can see, but still not much in the way of reception, certainly not on AM, and still very low volume and slightly distorted on FM. So the first thing I'm going to do in terms of the electronics is to do a recapping of it. In other words, replacing the capacitors, the paper ones and the electrolytic ones. And the first electrolytic I'm going to do is the big smoothing capacitor that you saw in the earlier episode that was actually leaking out of the top of it. Now, one of the sections had been replaced and it was just strung underneath, but it wasn't even the right value. Whoever was doing it put in a 16 microfarad. It should be a 50 microfarad. So what I'm going to do is take the tuning, not the tuning capacitor, the electrolytic capacitor out and restuff it. In other words, take out the guts of it and put two new capacitors in, two 47 microfarads. I think it's specified as 50 microfarad plus 50 microfarad, but 47s will do nicely. So that's the first job, and I won't show you the process because it's pretty boring, but I will take a few slides to show you what's happening as it goes on to save you the grief of getting bored. With the main filter capacitor restuffed, it's time now to recap the rest of this chassis. And for this project, I'm going to catalogue each individual capacitor as it comes out and measure its existing capacitance and its leakage. The recapping is now done, and I've replaced 7 capacitors on the top of the chassis. Most of them you can see here, orange drops, and there's a yellow one, and there's another yellow one buried down there. And around here on the volume control, there's another one. And also one electrolytic capacitor buried in the discriminator can in here. That was a tricky one to get out and replace again. A 2 microfarad, but that's done. And then underneath you can see a lot more capacitors replaced. All these yellow capacitors are new and in their correct positions. Hopefully they're correct values, and there's one orange drop as well, and there's a blue one. Now I discovered that actually 2 of the capacitors had been replaced at some stage, this one here and this one here. By the way, these 2 electrolytics were in perfect condition, so I didn't change these, I've left these. However, the most important capacitor replaced was this yellow one here, and I'll explain why. The offending capacitor is this one here on the circuit diagram, and what it does is it blocks DC voltage getting through from the previous valve to the final output valve, one of the final output valves anyway, and it was extremely leaky, so goodness knows what sort of DC voltage was getting onto the grid, and I'm lucky it didn't damage one of the output valves. I hope it hasn't anyway. And that certainly would have upset the balance between the 2 output valves, where the signal is split between one and the other and then combined in the output transformer. And this could have contributed towards the distortion I was getting, even though the sound volume was extremely low. While in troubleshooting mode, I tried to find out why the volume level was so low, and I started by replacing the valves one by one. And when I got to this valve here, the second IF valve, just as I pulled it out of its socket before it left completely, the sound sprang up into life. Pushed it back in, sound disappeared again. Pulled it back out, and just as it left the socket, the sound sprung into life again. So I started doing voltage readings around here and found out there was no screen voltage on this particular valve. It should be about 25 volts at this point here. And tracing it back down here, this was the offending resistor, open circuit 470k. And as soon as I replaced that, I got the required 25 volts and the radio sprang up into life. Fantastic reception, really loud, really clear. Problem solved. There was one other resistor I found that was way out of kilter. It's this particular one here. It's a 470k and it had gone up to about 700k. And it's around the magic eye tube of this radio. And it's not unusual in that most radios that have a magic eye, this resistor has changed over its lifetime. So I've replaced that, and I've also had to replace the magic eye itself, because it's not unusual in that these magic eye tubes only last a few years. Eventually the phosphor wears out and you can hardly see any indicator on it at all. So I'm going to replace this with a brand new Russian one to brighten up the display on this radio. Getting back to the capacitors, this is the casualty list. As you can see, quite a few were replaced. And as I replaced them, I took a note of them. And I don't know whether you can read this, but most of them ended up being leaky. A few of them were okay, but I replaced them anyway. The next job was to repair the tone button unit that was seized solidly. This entailed unsoldering all the connecting wires joined to it prior to photoing the attachments, as there were 17 separate wires. Then the buttons themselves were disassembled, after which the sliding ratchet was freed from its rusted condition. Cleaned, sanded, and the whole unit reassembled with a new rubber backstop. Finally, the wires were reconnected and the unit returned to the chassis. And this is the result. All the buttons are working perfectly now, selecting the different tone settings. The back plate has been painted in the meantime. New bulbs are illuminating the back plane. You can just about see the magic eye, but it's shining really brightly because it's brand new, or at least new old stock. The knobs themselves have been cleaned up, so everything is almost ready to go. The only thing I need to consider now as far as the electronics is concerned is whether it needs any alignment, but I'll let you have a listen to it as it stands at the moment. Now don't forget, I'm playing this through the speakers here in the workshop.
Moment for that, please, and thank you very much.
And then this would be AM, or medium wave in this case. Now, we don't have any medium wave reception here, as I've often mentioned, but I can play a little bit of music via a small AM transmitter that I have here connected up to the radio. So it's looking very good so far. At this stage, I think we'll close off this section of the video. And in the next section, I'll start looking at the cabinet and think about whether I need to do any alignment on this. But other than that, it's sounding pretty good at the moment. So if you have been, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me in the next segment.